The autumn evening had painted Boston's skyline in shades of gold and purple as Dr. Maya Richardson smoothly guided her motorized wheelchair along the bustling sidewalk. Her heart was light with excitement. After 5 years of relentless research and countless late nights in the lab, she had finally secured a $2.5 million grant to continue her groundbreaking work on spinal cord regeneration. The Golden Fork restaurant stood proud among the historic buildings, its warm lights beckoning through large windows. Maya had chosen this place carefully for her celebration dinner. Not only was it one of Boston's most talked about restaurants, but their website had specifically mentioned being wheelchair accessible. She'd even called ahead to confirm her reservation and accessibility needs. As she approached the entrance, Maya caught her reflection in the window. She traded her usual lab coat for a deep blue dress that complemented her dark skin, and her naturally curly hair was styled elegantly. A small smile played on her lips as she remembered her grandmother's words, "Always dress like you belong there, because you do." The hostess behind the podium looked up as Maya entered, and something flickered across her face, so brief anyone else might have missed it. But Maya had seen that look too many times before. A mixture of surprise, uncertainty, and something else she couldn't quite name. Still, she kept her warm smile in place as she approached. "Good evening," Maya said, her voice carrying the confidence earned through years of presenting research at international conferences. "I have a reservation for 7:00 p.m. under Dr. Richardson." The hostess, whose name tag read Kelly, shuffled through some papers, her movements suddenly seeming uncertain. The restaurant buzzed with conversation around them, the clink of fine china and crystal creating a sophisticated atmosphere. Several diners glanced their way, their eyes lingering a moment too long. "Let me just check something," Kelly said, her voice trailing off as she disappeared into the back, leaving Maya waiting at the entrance. Through the large windows, Maya could see several empty tables that could easily accommodate her wheelchair. She'd specifically requested one during her reservation. The scent of truffle and garlic wafted from the kitchen, reminding Maya that she'd been too excited about the grant to eat lunch. Her stomach growled softly, but the familiar knot of tension was beginning to form in her chest. She'd been here before, not at this restaurant, but in this situation. A few feet away, an older couple was being led to their table, though they'd arrived after her. Maya took a deep breath, centering herself. She'd defended her doctoral thesis, led groundbreaking research projects, and just secured major funding for her lab. This was just dinner, and she had every right to be here. The maitre d' emerged from the back, his expression carefully neutral as he approached. Behind him, Kelly hovered uncertainly, clutching menus. Maya straightened in her chair, her grandmother's voice echoing in her mind again. "Your presence is not a favor they're granting, it's a right you already have." The evening air still drifted in through the open door behind her, carrying the sounds of city life, car horns, distant laughter, the rumble of the tea in the distance. But inside the Golden Fork, time seemed to slow as the maitre d' cleared his throat, about to speak words that would set in motion events none of them could have anticipated. What happened next would not only change the Golden Fork forever, but would spark a conversation that would ripple through Boston's restaurant scene and beyond. But in that moment, Maya simply sat tall in her wheelchair, her doctoral ring catching the light, ready to face whatever came next with the same dignity and determination that had carried her through every other challenge in her life. The maitre d' stood before Maya, his hands clasped behind his back. "I apologize, Dr. Richardson, but we seem to have a situation with your reservation." His voice carried a practiced smoothness that didn't quite mask his discomfort. The restaurant's warm lighting cast shadows across his face as he spoke, making his expression hard to read. Maya had spent years navigating situations like this, and her response came with practiced patience. "I called ahead to confirm both the reservation and accessibility arrangements," she explained, pulling up the confirmation email on her phone. "Your staff assured me there wouldn't be any issues." The maitre d', whose golden nameplate read Robert, shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Yes, well, you see." He glanced around the dining room, where several empty tables sat perfectly accessible to Maya's wheelchair. "We're experiencing some space limitations tonight." A young server passing by with a tray of water glasses slowed her pace, clearly listening. Maya noticed her slight frown as she continued toward her assigned tables. The gentle clink of silverware and murmur of dinner conversations continued around them, but a bubble of tension was growing at the entrance. Space limitations. Maya repeated, her voice level but firm. She gestured to 3 empty 4-person tables, each easily accessible from the main aisle. Those tables appear to have plenty of space for my wheelchair, just as your website advertises. Robert's face tightened slightly. Those tables are reserved for other guests. The lie hung in the air between them, as transparent as the restaurant's front windows. Behind him, Kelly the hostess seemed to find her shoes fascinating, refusing to meet Maya's eyes. "You know," Maya said, keeping her voice steady despite the familiar heat of frustration rising in her chest, "the Americans with Disabilities Act requires restaurants to provide reasonable accommodations. I'm not asking for special treatment, just the same service you'd provide any other guest." A few diners at nearby tables had stopped eating, their conversations trailing off as they observed the scene unfolding. An elderly woman wearing a pearl necklace shook her head slightly, but disapproval clearly directed at the restaurant staff, not Maya. Robert's professional veneer cracked slightly. "Perhaps," he said, his tone growing defensive, "you might be more comfortable at a different establishment. One better suited to your specific needs." The words came out clipped, each one carrying the weight of years of unchallenged prejudice. Maya felt a familiar surge of emotions, frustration, anger, hurt, but years of facing similar situations had taught her how to channel these feelings constructively. She reached for her phone again, this time opening the camera app. "I'd like to document this interaction," she said calmly. "Could you please repeat what you just said about my specific needs?" The phone's presence changed something in the air. Robert's eyes widened slightly, and Kelly took a small step backward. A couple at a nearby table, a man and woman who looked to be in their 30s, exchanged glances before the woman stood up. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the now quieter restaurant. "We've eaten here before, and I distinctly remember seeing people with mobility devices being seated at those exact tables." Her husband nodded in agreement, also rising from his chair. Other diners were now openly watching, their meals forgotten. A businessman in a crisp suit set down his wine glass, his expression darkening as he observed the discrimination playing out before him. An older couple whispered to each other, the woman pulling out her own phone. Maya's wheelchair-mounted tablet, which she used for both work and personal matters, displayed the time. Only 15 minutes had passed since she arrived, though it felt like hours. The grand celebration she planned was turning into something very different, but perhaps equally important. "I'd like to speak with the owner," Maya said, her voice clear and composed. She presented research to rooms full of skeptical scientists. She could handle this situation with the same professional grace. "And I'd like to understand why, despite your website's claims about accessibility and my confirmed reservation, you're refusing to serve me." The tension in the restaurant had become almost physical, like the air before a storm. More phones had appeared in diners' hands, and snippets of conversation made it clear that social media posts were being crafted. Robert's forehead had begun to glisten with sweat under the warm lighting. A young server, the same one who had been listening earlier, approached a host's stand. She appeared to be struggling with herself for a moment before speaking. "I think," she started, then straightened her shoulders. "I recognized Dr. Richardson from somewhere." Her eyes lit up with sudden realization, and she pulled out her phone, quickly searching for something. What happened next would transform an act of discrimination into something none of them expected, a moment that would not only change the Golden Fork, but ripple through the entire community. The young server's recognition was about to shift the entire dynamic, but for now, Maya sat tall in her wheelchair, her dignity intact, representing not just herself, but everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. The young server's fingers moved quickly across her phone screen, her eyes lighting up with recognition. Around her, the Golden Fork had transformed from a bustling restaurant into a stage where something important was unfolding. The soft classical music playing through hidden speakers seemed oddly out of place now, like a gentle soundtrack to a mounting storm. "Look," the server said, turning her phone screen toward her colleagues. "Dr. Richardson was on Channel 5 last month. She's leading groundbreaking research on spinal cord injuries at the university." Her voice carried a mix of awe and embarrassment, awe at Maya's accomplishments, embarrassment at how she was being treated. Maya kept her phone steady, still recording. Years of documenting research had taught her the importance of keeping evidence. But this wasn't a scientific experiment. This was her life and the lives of countless others who faced similar discrimination every day. The couple who had first spoken up moved closer, positioning themselves near Maya. "We're happy to be witnesses," the woman said quietly. She pulled out a business card. She was an attorney. "This kind of discrimination is unacceptable." Her husband nodded, his arms crossed as he looked disapprovingly at Robert. More diners began to stand. An elderly man using a cane spoke up from his table near the window. "I've been coming here for 20 years, he said, his voice wavering with age but firm with conviction. "Never thought I'd see the day when this place would turn someone away because of a wheelchair. Shameful." The buzz of phones filled the air as more people began documenting the scene. Someone mentioned Twitter. Another person was typing furiously on Facebook. The power of social media was turning this private indignity into a public stand for justice. Robert, the maitre had begun to visibly sweat. His earlier confidence crumbled as he realized the situation was spiraling beyond his control. Kelly, the hostess, had disappeared entirely, presumably to find someone with more authority to handle the situation. A group of medical students who had been celebrating the end of their exams approached Maya. "Dr. Richardson," one of them said, "we just studied your paper on neural regeneration in our advanced biology class. Your work is incredible." The young student's words carried across the now quiet restaurant, adding another layer to the unfolding story. This wasn't just about discrimination, it was about respect. The businessman who had been watching earlier stood up, straightening his tie. "I sit on the board of several restaurants in the city," he announced. "This type of behavior isn't just morally wrong, it's bad business. Boston is better than this." His words seemed to hang in the air, carrying the weight of both moral and economic consequences. Maya felt a complex mix of emotions. She hadn't asked to become the center of this drama, she just wanted to celebrate her grant in peace. But sometimes, she reflected, change only happens when someone is willing to stand their ground. Or in her case, stay seated firmly in their wheelchair. An older woman with silver hair, dining alone at a corner table, wiped her mouth with her napkin and raised her hand to get everyone's attention. "I've been quietly recording this whole interaction," she said, her voice carrying the authority of a retired schoolteacher. "And I've already sent it to my daughter who works at the local news station." The restaurant had completely transformed. What had started as a simple dinner reservation had become a moment of community solidarity. Strangers from different walks of life, lawyers, medical students, business people, retirees, had united around a basic principle: discrimination had no place in their city. The young server who had recognized Maya was still standing nearby, shifting nervously from foot to foot. She started, then found her courage. "I wanted to be a doctor before life took a different turn. Dr. Richardson's research gives hope to so many people. This isn't right." Tears glistened in her eyes, but her voice was strong. Through it all, Maya maintained her composure. She'd faced discrimination before, but this time felt different. This time she wasn't alone. The community around her had risen up, turning an act of discrimination into a powerful display of solidarity. Her phone continued recording, capturing not just the injustice, but also the response, a spontaneous uprising of human decency. As the minutes ticked by, it became clear that this evening would be remembered not for the discrimination that started it, but for the way ordinary people chose to stand against it. The air in the Golden Fork crackled with the energy of people who had decided, collectively, that enough was enough. And then, just as the situation seemed to have reached its peak, rapid footsteps could be heard from the back of the restaurant. The owner, alerted to the situation, was about to enter the scene. But what had started as one woman's stand for dignity had already transformed into something bigger, a community's refusal to accept discrimination in their midst. The young server's discovery about Maya's identity spread through the restaurant like a wave, changing the atmosphere with each passing moment. She held up her phone, showing a recent news clip to her colleagues. On the screen, Maya stood at a podium, confidently explaining her breakthrough research that offered new hope to people with spinal cord injuries. "She's developing treatments that could help people walk again," the server explained, her voice filled with admiration. The clip showed Maya in her lab coat, surrounded by advanced equipment, directing a team of researchers. The contrast between that image and how she was being treated now struck everyone who saw it. The medical students who had recognized Maya's work began sharing stories about her research. Her latest paper changed how we understand nerve regeneration, one student explained to nearby diners. She's literally rewriting medical textbooks. Their excited voices carried across the restaurant, painting a picture of Maya's contributions to science that made the discrimination she faced even more glaring. Robert, the maitre d', had turned pale as he realized the magnitude of their mistake. The restaurant hadn't just turned away a customer, they'd discriminated against a respected scientist whose work was changing lives. His hands trembled slightly as he looked at his phone, where social media was already buzzing with posts about the incident. An older gentleman at a corner table spoke up. "My nephew is paralyzed from a motorcycle accident," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He's been following Dr. Richardson's research for years. It gives him hope." He stood up, leaving his half-finished meal. "I can't stay in a place that treats people this way." The attorney who had offered to be a witness was now explaining to other diners how the restaurant's actions violated multiple laws. "The Americans with Disabilities Act is very clear about this," she said. "But beyond the legal issues, this is about human dignity." Her words resonated through the now quiet dining room. Maya watched as people pulled up articles about her work on their phones. A mother showed her young daughter a video of Maya speaking at a science conference. "See," she whispered, loud enough for others to hear, "this is why I tell you that you can be anything you want to be, no matter what anyone says." The business people who had been having a dinner meeting nearby had completely abandoned their discussion about quarterly reports. One of them was reading aloud from a scientific journal on his tablet. Dr. Richardson's innovative approach to neural regeneration has been called potentially revolutionary by leading experts in the field. Through all of this, Maya maintained her composure, though her eyes showed a mix of emotions. She hadn't come here seeking recognition. She just wanted to celebrate her latest research grant with a nice dinner. Now her private accomplishments had become part of a public lesson about judgment and prejudice. Kelly, the hostess who had first greeted Maya, returned from the back of the restaurant. Her face showed the impact of what she'd learned about their customer. "Dr. Richardson," she said softly, "my sister is in physical therapy school. She studies your research." The young woman's voice cracked with shame. The retired teacher who had been recording everything provided commentary as she filmed. "This is what happens when we judge people without knowing their story," she said to her phone camera. "But it shouldn't matter whether someone is a famous scientist or not. Everyone deserves respect." A line cook had come out from the kitchen, still wearing his apron. He stood at the kitchen door, watching the scene unfold. "My mom uses a wheelchair," he said, his voice carrying across the restaurant. "She's been turned away from places too. Never thought I'd work somewhere that would do that." He untied his apron slowly, making a decision about his future employment. The news about Maya's identity had transformed the atmosphere completely. What started as a case of discrimination had become a moment of revelation, not just about who Maya was, but about how quickly prejudice can blind people to the full humanity of others. The young server who had first recognized Maya was now showing other staff members an online video of Maya receiving an award for her research. "She's working on technology that could change thousands of lives," she explained. "And we almost turned her away because of the very thing that inspired her research." Just then, heavy footsteps could be heard hurrying from the back of the restaurant. The owner, who had finally been reached, was about to enter the scene. But now he wouldn't just be facing a customer who had been discriminated against. He would be facing a respected scientist whose mistreatment at his restaurant was already spreading across social media. The evening had become a powerful lesson about assumptions and their consequences. Every person in the restaurant had become part of a story that would be told and retold, not just about discrimination, but about recognition, respect, and the importance of seeing the full humanity in every person who comes through your door. The owner burst through the kitchen doors, slightly out of breath from rushing downstairs. He was a man in his 50s with kind eyes and graying hair at his temples, wearing a well-worn chef's coat. The moment he entered the dining room, he could feel the tension in the air. "What's going on here?" he asked, his eyes sweeping across the scene. the standing customers, the phones recording, his uncomfortable staff, and Maya sitting tall in her wheelchair. The young server quickly approached him, showing the news clip on her phone and whispering an explanation. The owner's face transformed as he listened, color draining from his cheeks. But it wasn't just the recognition of Maya's scientific achievements that affected him. Something deeper crossed his features as he looked at her wheelchair. "Dr. Richardson," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm Thomas, the owner of the Golden Fork." He pulled up a chair to sit at eye level with Maya, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the watching crowd. "Before I say anything else, I need to sincerely apologize for how you've been treated tonight." He ran a hand through his hair, gathering his thoughts. "My mother," he paused, collecting himself. "My mother has been using a wheelchair for the past 3 years. She lives with me upstairs, right above this restaurant." His voice cracked slightly. "She's the reason I installed the ramps and modified the bathrooms. I thought I had created a welcoming space for everyone." The restaurant had fallen completely silent, the background music the only sound as Thomas continued. "To think that my own staff—" He shook his head, clearly struggling with his emotions. "To think that anyone would be turned away because of a wheelchair. It's not just illegal, it's personal for me." Maya's expression softened slightly, though she maintained her dignified composure. The phones were still recording, capturing this raw moment of realization and regret. Thomas turned to face his staff, standing up with determination. "Robert Kelly, please go home. We'll discuss this tomorrow." His voice was firm but not angry. "This isn't just about breaking the law or embarrassing the restaurant. This is about basic human dignity." The crowd watched as Robert and Kelly gathered their things, heads down, and left through the front door. The young server who had recognized Maya stood straighter, a small smile of approval on her face. "Dr. Richardson," Thomas continued, turning back to Maya, "I understand if you want to take legal action. You'd be well within your rights." He spread his hands in a gesture of openness. "But I'd like to make this right, if you'll give me the chance." The businessman who had mentioned sitting on restaurant boards spoke up. "The real question is, what changes will you make to ensure this never happens again?" Thomas nodded, already pulling out his phone and opening the Notes app. "First, we're implementing immediate disability awareness training for all staff." He began typing as he spoke. "I'm ashamed I didn't do this sooner. I just assumed." He shook his head. "I assumed having the physical accommodations was enough." The attorney who had offered to be a witness added her thoughts. "Regular training is crucial, but you also need clear policies and consequences for discrimination." "Absolutely," Thomas agreed. He looked around the restaurant, seeing it through new eyes. "You know, my mother hasn't eaten here in months. She says it's because she's not hungry, but now I wonder." His voice trailed off as realization dawned on his face. The elderly teacher with the phone spoke up. "Why don't you invite her down now?" Her suggestion carried the wisdom of years in the classroom. "Let her see that you're making real changes." Thomas's eyes lit up. He pulled out his phone again, this time making a call. "Mom, can you come down to the restaurant? There's someone I'd like you to meet." He listened for a moment, then smiled. "Yes, bring your chair. That's actually why I'm calling." The atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted completely. What had started as an incident of discrimination was transforming into something unexpected, a moment of genuine change. The diners who had stood up in support now sat back down, but their attention remained focused on the unfolding scene. The line cook who had almost quit came back out, his apron still off. "Does this mean we're going to do things differently from now on?" he asked, hope evident in his voice. Thomas nodded firmly. "Everything changes tonight. Dr. Richardson," he turned back to Maya, "would you consider helping us? Your insight would be invaluable in making this place truly accessible and welcoming for everyone." The gentle whirring of an electric wheelchair could be heard from the back stairs. Thomas's mother was arriving, about to add another layer to this evening's unexpected turns. The transformation of the Golden Fork was just beginning, but already the air felt lighter, filled with the possibility of real change. 2 weeks after the incident, the Golden Fork's dining room looked very different. Instead of elegant place settings and wine glasses, the tables were covered with training materials and notepads. The restaurant was closed for the day, but it was far from empty. Every chair was filled with staff members, both from the Golden Fork and several other local restaurants. Maya sat at the front of the room, her wheelchair positioned next to a projector screen. She'd traded her celebration dress for a professional blazer, her natural educator's instincts taking over as she led the disability awareness training session. The key isn't just following laws, she explained, gesturing to the slides behind her. It's about understanding the human experience. Her voice carried the perfect blend of authority and approachability. Every person who comes through those doors has a story, has dignity, has value. Thomas's mother, Mrs. Chen, sat nearby in her own wheelchair, adding her perspectives throughout the session. I stopped going to restaurants for months, she shared, her voice gentle but firm. Not because I couldn't physically access them, but because of the looks, the awkward interactions, the feeling of being unwelcome. The young server who had recognized Maya that night raised her hand. I never realized how many little things we do that can make someone feel uncomfortable, she admitted. Like asking someone in a wheelchair if they can walk a few steps to reach a table instead of just finding an accessible table in the first place. Around the room, people nodded. The line cook who had almost quit that night was taking detailed notes. He'd been promoted to staff trainer and was determined to make sure new employees understood the importance of accessibility and respect from day one. Thomas stood up to share his own learning journey. I thought having ramps and accessible bathrooms was enough, he said, shaking his head. But true accessibility is about attitude, about making everyone feel truly welcome. He looked at his mother with new understanding in his eyes. The business people who had witnessed the original incident had kept their word about spreading change through the restaurant industry. Thanks to their connections, restaurant owners from across the city were sending their staff to these training sessions. Let's do a practical exercise, Maya suggested, bringing out some folders. I want you to try navigating common restaurant situations from a new perspective. She handed out scenarios written on cards. These are real experiences that people with disabilities have shared with me. The room buzzed as staff members role-played different situations. A host practiced greeting a blind guest and their service dog. A server learned how to respectfully describe menu items to someone with limited hand mobility. A bartender worked on communicating with a deaf customer. Mrs. Chen wheeled herself between the groups, adding insights from her personal experience. Remember, she said, watching a particularly thoughtful interaction, we're not asking for special treatment. We're asking for equal access to the same experiences everyone else enjoys. The attorney who had offered to be a witness that night had helped develop clear policies for the restaurant. She now stood at the back of the room, watching with satisfaction as staff members learned about their legal obligations, not as burdens to bear, but as tools for creating a more inclusive environment. One of the medical students who had been there that night had started a social media campaign. On the wall, a large screen showed their hashtag trending locally, #AccessForAll. Photos and stories from the training sessions were being shared, inspiring other businesses to examine their own practices. Maya brought out her laptop to show some emails she'd received. These are from people with disabilities who visited the Golden Fork in the past 2 weeks, she explained. They say they've never felt more welcome in a restaurant. Her smile carried the satisfaction of seeing real change in action. The retired teacher who had recorded the original incident was there too, this time documenting the training for a positive reason. This is how change happens, she said, panning her camera across the engaged faces in the room. One conversation, one lesson, one mind at a time. Thomas had placed a new sign in the restaurant's window, "Everyone's welcome here," and we mean everyone. But more importantly, his staff was being trained to live up to those words. As the afternoon session wound down, Maya noticed something remarkable. The staff members weren't just learning about accessibility. They were sharing their own stories, asking thoughtful questions, and genuinely engaging with the material. This wasn't just corporate training, it was a transformation of hearts and minds. The young server approached Maya during the break. "You know," she said, "that night when you came in, I was scared to speak up at first. But now I understand. Staying silent when we see discrimination is being part of the problem." She straightened her shoulders. "I'll never be quiet about this again." Maya smiled, remembering her own journey from that night of discrimination to this moment of education and change. Sometimes, she reflected, the most powerful teaching moments come from the most difficult experiences. 6 months had passed since that transformative night at the Golden Fork. The restaurant's warm lighting now illuminated a very different scene from the one that had unfolded half a year ago. The dining room buzzed with diverse groups of people, some in wheelchairs, others using canes or walkers, families with children, elderly couples, and young professionals all sharing the space comfortably. At a corner table, Maya sat with Thomas and his mother, Mrs. Chen, celebrating the success of their accessibility initiative. The table had been specially designed to accommodate wheelchairs perfectly, just one of many changes that had been implemented over the past months. "I never imagined that difficult night would lead to all this," Thomas said, gesturing around the restaurant. A new automated door system had been installed at the entrance. The menu now included Braille versions, and the staff moved through the space with a natural awareness of accessibility needs. The young server who had recognized Maya that night was now the restaurant's accessibility coordinator. She approached their table with a tablet in hand. "The feedback from last week's community dinner was amazing," she reported excitedly. "3 other restaurants in the neighborhood have asked for our training materials." Mrs. Chen smiled as she watched a host confidently guide a blind guest and their service dog to a table. "Remember when I was afraid to come down to eat in my own son's restaurant?" she asked, shaking her head. "Now I'm here almost every day." The line cook who had almost quit now ran the kitchen with a new perspective. He created a program to hire people with disabilities in the kitchen, proving that with proper accommodations, talent could flourish anywhere. The sounds and smells from the kitchen spoke of both excellent food and inclusive employment practices. Maya pulled out her phone to show them something. "Look at this," she said, opening a local news website. The headline read, "Boston Restaurants Leading the Way in Accessibility Revolution." The Golden Fork story had sparked a movement that was spreading across the city. The business people who had witnessed the original incident had kept their word. Through their influence, a network of disability-friendly restaurants had formed. They shared resources, training materials, and success stories. The Golden Fork had become their unofficial headquarters. "Dr. Richardson," called out a voice. It was one of the medical students from that night, now a resident at the local hospital. She often brought her colleagues here for dinner. "Your latest research paper is making waves in the rehabilitation community." Science and social change had found a meeting point in this unexpectedly meaningful space. The attorney who had offered to be a witness had helped draft a citywide initiative for restaurant accessibility standards. She now sat at the bar, discussing implementation strategies with other business owners who regularly sought advice on making their establishments more inclusive. On the walls, framed articles told the story of the Golden Fork's transformation. But more importantly, the daily reality of the restaurant spoke louder than any written word. Every staff member had been trained not just in the mechanics of accessibility, but in the human aspects of creating a truly welcoming space. Robert, the former maitre d' who had initially turned Maya away, had taken the experience to heart. After sincere apologies and deep reflection, he now worked at a disability rights organization, using his story to teach others about the importance of confronting their own biases. The retired teacher who had recorded the original incident had created a documentary about the restaurant's journey. It was being used in hospitality training programs across the country. Sometimes, she'd said in the film, the most powerful changes start with one person willing to stand, or sit, for what's right. Thomas had expanded the restaurant's mission beyond food. The Golden Fork now hosted monthly community dinners where people with and without disabilities could share meals and stories. These events had become so popular that they needed a waiting list. Maya's research lab had benefited too. The attention from the incident had led to increased funding and awareness for her work on spinal cord injuries. She'd recently hired 2 researchers who used wheelchairs, knowing they'd find a welcoming environment both in her lab and at her favorite restaurant. The young server approached their table again, this time with a special dessert. In honor of 6 months of change, she said, placing a beautifully decorated plate before them. The chocolate design read "Access for All," the hashtag that had started a movement. As they shared the dessert, Maya reflected on how a moment of discrimination had transformed into a force for positive change. The Golden Fork had become more than a restaurant. It was a model for how businesses could create truly inclusive spaces. Mrs. Chen raised her glass in a toast. "To everyone who helped turn a bad night into a better future," she said. The surrounding diners, many of whom knew the story, lifted their glasses too. The clink of crystal merged with the sound of wheels on wood floors, tap of canes, and happy chatter of a truly diverse crowd. The evening demonstrated how far they'd come, but also reminded them of how much work still lay ahead. As Maya looked around the restaurant, she saw not just changes in physical space, but in hearts and minds. Sometimes, she thought, the most lasting transformations start with a single moment of standing up, or in her case, staying seated for what's right.